Hey everybody, and welcome to another edition of What the Fact. I'm Aaron Shirachman.
And I'm Katie Sanders.
We're editors of PolitiFact, the largest fact-checking organization in the United States, and I can say this unequivocally, the only fact-checking group with its own 30-minute television show.
That's right. This past week, our team of reporters really dug through a bunch of statements from politicians and pundits and publishers, holding them accountable for what they say to voters. We rate those statements on our Truthometer, which starts at true, pristine statement, the best rating, goes to mostly true, half true, mostly false, false, and then finally our award for ridiculous statements, pants on fire.
All that good work is available on PolitiFact.com, and you should go there, but not just yet. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to highlight some of our most important work of the week. We're going to look in on Donald Trump, who's making a puzzling claim about how Japan tests its cars. It involves a bowling ball. Then we're going to go on to the 2018 campaign trail, where some candidates are already making claims in some of the hot races around the country.
But first, we're going to give you the truth behind some wrong but viral claims that have been circulating on social media in a segment that we call, Did You Really Fall for That?
If you saw pictures earlier this month of thousands of shoes spread out on the lawn at the US Capitol, you might have also seen this graphic claiming they represented the more than 7,000 kids killed in US schools since 2012. But they don't. The shoes represent the number of children killed by all gun violence since the Sandy Hook school shooting in 2012. That's based on a 2017 study that estimates 1,300 children die every year from a gunshot wound. The number of people who have died in U.S. school shootings since Sandy Hook is 138. That includes school faculty and staff. So the number of children killed in U.S. school shootings in that time is nowhere near 7,000. But that didn't stop this image from getting a lot of attention.
All right, Katie, so this claim is wrong, and what's actually interesting here is one of the groups who kind of spread the wrong message admitted it. They acknowledged that their meme was wrong. But does including that disclosure in the comments really cut it?
What do you think, Aaron? No, absolutely not. It's so funny. We see these memes get circulated all over, and sometimes we see groups that are just like a touch more conscientious about it try to put the correction into like literal fine print in the comments next to the meme, but they don't do anything to change the meme or the viral image itself. So who's paying attention to the comments? Who is reading the fine print? Not nearly as many people who are seeing these eye-popping statistics, especially in this example comparing deaths from school, or I guess deaths of all children in school shootings, which was the wrong comparison to people who have been killed in wars. So we did see this group try to correct itself, or correct the meme, and several times, not once, but several times in the comments, because surprise, surprise, people kept getting the wrong impression from the information. And by this point, it had been debunked. So they were people were pointing out that it had been debunked. And the group was defending itself like, no, we said all along, it's inaccurate, but we just think like the spirit of it is
viral. Images are meant to go viral, but it's very difficult for them to be accurate because we're talking about, in many cases, very pieces or elements that require a lot of context. Another point that's really here that's interesting is that everyone who's used this statistic said it comes from the CDC, but there's even a little bit more to that story. Fill us in on that, Katie.
Yeah, so a lot of people had covered this story, and they noted that the statistics, because the advocacy group that came out with the shoes on the Capitol lawn, the group behind this demonstration, said their numbers came from the CDC. So, of course, we went to the CDC to try to find where this estimate was coming from. And we found some numbers that were quite different than this yearly estimate of children of all ages who had been killed by guns. So what our reporter found was that it was not actually from the CDC itself. It was from CDC-affiliated researchers who were doing work for an academic journal, Pediatrics. And that was in the summer of 2017. So the data, it's coming from a reputable place, but it's not exactly what the group had described the underlying data is coming from.
Yeah, when you peel back the layers of an onion on all those stories, there seems to be always something more to it than meets the eye, or at least is presented. That's interesting. Thanks, Katie. We want to get to one more fake news story before we go in this segment. The news comes from Viral Politics US, another ridiculous-sounding website. They said Vladimir Putin Putin, congratulations, I guess, on your re-election.
Or not congratulations.
I know.
Kind of up for debate.
I understand. we might talk about that in the next segment a little bit. Putin issues international arrest warrant for Soros. That's George Soros. Now, Putin is happy. Of course, he just won re-election. The president congratulated him, creating a little stir. But is Putin kind of using that victory to go after George Soros here, a known Democratic funder?
No. Do you want to press the button? Or
you can hold the sign. I'll press the button.
Okay, 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, that one's pants on fire.
In so many of these fake news stories that we debunk, we find that once you get past the headline, which is obviously mostly inflammatory and wrong, the bones of the story, not surprisingly, don't hold up. So in this case, the story was conflating statements about George Soros with actually an article that appeared in Rolling Stone that wasn't even about George Soros. It was about Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
Using some really colorful language to describe.
Yeah, so I mean, what I guess you could argue is true is George Soros tends to promote open societies. That's one of his foundations. So in January, while speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Soros said that open societies are in crisis and various forms of dictatorships and mafia states exemplified by Putin's Russia are on the rise. So he didn't say a nice thing about Russia.
Yeah, they're not buddies.
And Putin. And then in October of 2016, Soros criticized Putin for Russia's bombing in Syria and called on him to put an end to this heinous crime against humanity. So it's clear George Soros doesn't like Vladimir Putin. Probably the feeling is mutual, but we checked this story out. It's bogus. There is no arrest warrant for George Soros. Putin hasn't issued it. So he's maybe busy, wrestling bears or fishing or whatever Putin does, I guess.
Horseback riding.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the interesting thing for us from a fact checker perspective is that this is not the only pants on fire rated statement involving George Soros. We've rated a lot of statements involving him because he's kind of invoked as a sort of boogeyman figure when there's any kind of cultural clash that's going on. So I remember we evaluated a statement that George Soros was funding the response to the uprising in Charlottesville. Remember? We didn't find any evidence of that. Over the years, we've both been doing this for a few years, we find that he is invoked not always accurately, kind of like anti-conservative ways.
Yeah, so don't necessarily trust the memes about George Soros. Check them out, as you should always. Go to PolitiFact.com. We'll help sort it out for you. All right, coming up, we're going to take a look at Donald Trump and some of the statements he's been making. And we brought up prop, an HR-approved prop. Yeah. So stick around and we'll be right back.
Welcome back, everybody, to What the Fact. I'm Katie. This is Aaron.
And now it's time to talk about our president, Donald Trump, who is making a lot of factual claims. He always does every week. One that really caught our attention was something that kind of perplexed even his advisors in the White House. He was talking about how Japan strength tests its cars to test the safety using a bowling ball. So let's see if that checks out.
At a private fundraising event earlier this month, President Donald Trump was talking about trade when he brought up standards for cars in Japan. This is what he said. Quote, "It's called the bowling ball test. They take a bowling ball from 20 feet up in the air and they drop it on the hood of the car. And if the hood dents, then the car doesn't qualify." At the White House press briefing the next day, it came up.
I worked in Japan for about 20 years. I covered the automotive industry. I don't recall anything like this. No one we've spoken with in the industry recalls it. Did you speak with the president about this, and where did he get this from?
Look, the president's been talking about unfair trade practices for decades. It's not new for him. Obviously, he's joking about this particular test, but it illustrates the creative ways some countries are able to keep American goods out of their markets.
Does it? It turns out there is a test in Japan where a hemisphere-shaped object is fired at the front end of a car to test how much force someone's head would have to absorb if the car hit them. But that test is about the human head, not about the car. In fact, in that test, the more give a car has, the better it is for the skull. So in this case, the president's talk of this bowling ball test is just false.
Okay, so the lawyers would not approve us dropping an actual bowling ball on our desk for fear of it breaking.
Yeah.
So we have this soccer volleyball thing,
You could not be stopped.
which I still can't drop, but here it is. I'm going to throw it over there. It's gone. Katie, so this is an interesting fact check.
On many levels.
Yeah, and you're kind of our Japan expert. You've
Yes.
visited a couple times. You've done fact checks about Japan. You've written about American cars in Japan and their challenges. Donald Trump couldn't have picked a worse claim to make for a PolitiFact fact checker to be on duty ready to go.
Exactly. Exactly right. American cars do have a number of obstacles in Japan. And I mean, I will say that there is the thinnest thread of something to this claim that there is a test that they have to meet to be sold in Japan. But Trump mingled every detail of the test. For one, it's not a bowling ball. It's also not a soccer ball that is kind of propelled at the hoods of cars.
Right.
It's like a 10-pound hemispheric object that's really shot at the hood of a vehicle. I mean, it would be interesting if it was dropped from 20 feet, like a David Letterman show kind of prank.
Yeah.
There were videos speculating about what Trump might
In
have been
season
talking
2,
about.
that we'll have that for our budget.
Yeah, we'll
Season
go
1, we don't
outside
have
to the
that.
streets. No, but we're not going to have that, and Donald Trump is describing this test as wrong.
Yeah.
And that is not what it is all about. He also describes the purpose of the test inaccurately. It's not if the hood dents, then they don't buy it. It's actually kind of good. It's a pedestrian head safety test that's required in Japan. I didn't do the reporting on this, but our reporter, John Greenberg, was, I think he went on an interesting mission to try to find, untangle what Trump could have been talking about. And I think he knew more about it than Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who said he was obviously joking.
Yeah, it's funny because I think like if you play back like kind of the week of events, we were fact checking this at the same time. I think the White House was trying to figure out what he was talking about.
Yeah.
And so in the course of that kind of our investigation, the White House basically came out and said it was a joke, or he was just kind of speaking like he was just using it as an example or something like that.
Yeah.
They were kind of defending the president. But there had been reports that he's talked about this a lot and often. And it's not the first time he's talked about U.S. automakers and the difference between U.S. automakers and automakers in Japan and some of the problems there. Then we looked at another claim earlier about Trump having to do with Japan and U.S. automakers, right?
Yeah, I mean, in his classic way on the campaign trails, actually in his opening speech when he was announcing from Trump Tower that he was entering the race, he said, "You go to Tokyo, Chevy doesn't exist in Japan. It doesn't exist, folks." He said something like that. So I was the reporter on that story, and we rated that mostly false because it does exist. It's an overstatement to say that Chevy and other American car makers don't have any kind of presence in Japan. But what I learned when I went to Tokyo a few months later for a totally separate reporting fellowship was it is really hard to find one. He does have a point.
Yeah.
That it's hard to find cars, American-made cars in Tokyo. I was actually at the famous Shibuya crossing with my friend who's a photographer. We were looking, because I mean there are so many cars on this crossing going back and forth, and we were like looking and looking and looking for an American car, and we found like a tricked out, like baby blue Chevy. I forget the make and model, but it was like a. It was not your typical
an antique,
Impala. It was like
yeah.
a show car. This guy was like, he knew he had American muscle, and he was really proud of it. But basically, American cars are kind of too big for the road. There's a lot of obstacles. Obviously, I could talk about this for this whole show.
So going back to the bowling ball, how do we rate that claim?
We rated that claim false.
All right, so that's a false for Donald Trump.
Yes.
That's not the only bit of news that Donald Trump's been making. He's also been talking a little bit about the obstruction of Democrats trying to confirm his nominees. After the firing of Rex Tillerson, he said hundreds of good people, including very important ambassadors and judges, are being blocked and or slowed by the Democrats in the Senate. This is from a tweet, of course, and he said many important positions in the government are unfulfilled because of this obstruction.
Right, and that's really the crux of the overstatement in play. We rated this statement half true, which means it's partially accurate, but it's missing critical context. That could paint a different impression.
Yeah, I mean, I think like when you look at this, it's certainly, let's be honest, Democrats are obstructing some of his nominees, slowing down the process for some of them. But what's also true, and what we've been able to report, using experts, groups like a group called the Partnership for Public Service that tracks political appointees, they found that Trump has just appointed a lot fewer people, and that at an average rate of 81 days per confirmation, Trump's nominees have experienced more lag time than those appointed by recent presidents. So I think it's a nuanced claim in where it's a little bit on him for not filling a lot of these jobs. But yes, there is a lag, and quite frankly, the Senate has become a partisan battleground for every nominee, starting with Neil Gorsuch of the Supreme Court and going on from there. It's also important to know that the GOP, by the way, has held up some nominations as well. Next, when we come back, is our final segment. We're going to take a look ahead. It's already election time. It's 2018.
I'm sorry to tell you, but hate to break it to you.
So we're going out on the campaign trail with a couple candidates in kind of big key races and looking at a couple statements they've been making. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to What the Fact. I'm Katie and this is Aaron, and we're going to give you your last bit of truth for the day, but hopefully you're getting more doses than that during the week.
Yeah, you should. You should be visiting PolitiFact.com like every day if you're not. But as we teased, we're hitting the campaign trail for an early look at the midterm elections and some of the important races and some of the important themes that we think we're going to see a lot between now and November. First, we're going to go to North Dakota, where incumbent Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp is one of up for re-election and under threat in that state, or obviously a very red state. She's defending a new rewrite of the financial reform law. She's actually being criticized by Democrats in this one. Take a look.
The Senate just passed a rewrite of the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act that imposed regulations on the country's biggest banks. It's aimed at loosening some of the restrictions that bill put in place, but there's some disagreement, even within the Democratic Party, about what the bill means.
Give me a break. This bill is about goosing the bottom line and executive bonuses at the banks that make up the top 0.5% of banks in this country by size. The very tippy top.
This is not a giveaway to Wall Street. It is not a giveaway to the largest institutions. Our bipartisan bill makes targeted, common-sense fixes so it will provide tangible relief to community banks and credit unions so that they can lend to borrowers in rural America and support rural communities.
Both of those two people are Democrats. So who's right? Well, on the one hand, Senator Elizabeth Warren raises the point that regulations on big banks could be relaxed. They could. But even if they are, the feds would still have huge regulatory power over them. On the other hand, Senator Heidi Heitkamp has a point that the regulations being loosened might be getting mischaracterized. The new bill leaves a lot up to the Federal Reserve as far as how it regulates the big banks. That said, under the new legislation, big banks would be able to count some municipal bonds as part of the reserves they could sell if they needed to avoid another bailout. Some experts say that could make it easier for mega banks to take on greater risk, even if they keep following the rules. So there are arguments to be made on both sides. Keep in mind that this bill isn't a pass for Wall Street to do what it wants, but it also isn't free and clear of changing regulations for big banks. Both arguments leave out important details.
So, Aaron, I learned a lot from this fact check. Financial reform for many of us is getting a little lost in this daily storm of tweets and attacks on the special counsel, but it's
not getting a lot of
important
news coverage, except on What the Fact right now.
Bringing you the news you need.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Aaron, please break it down for us. This is complicated stuff.
Yeah, and probably the thing here is it's unsatisfying that we ultimately rated this claim half true, but I think it's an appropriate rating that basically says...
Our most common rating.
Yes, actually, that both Heidi Heitkamp and Elizabeth Warren in this back and forth have a point. We actually, as part of our reporting, we talked to Barney Frank, the former House member from Massachusetts, who was obviously a driving force behind Dodd-Frank and the regulations of the big banks after the Wall Street crash in 2008. And he said that he believed that actually some of these reforms are very much needed. I'm not going to go into, I'm not an expert, so I don't want to mess it up. But basically, the original law classified big banks in a way that, to Barney Frank and others, brought in too many banks, brought in regional and smaller banks. And so what this new law proposed by Heidi Heitkamp does is it tries to raise a threshold in what essentially qualifies as a big bank to try to really target the big Wall Street firms, the people that were the original targets of this legislation. Now, people like Elizabeth Warren say that we've essentially created ways for them to game the system, to kind of calculate their asset levels different, to kind of avoid being targeted, or kind of and that is certainly, I think, possible. I think there are some fair criticism and concerns about what will happen, but in reality, as we kind of went through this proposal, really in many ways it seemed like what we came to was this is maybe a true compromise proposal that was supported by different types of people, different types of parties and politicians, and so again, I think Heidi Heitkamp has a point in defending her record. I think what Elizabeth Warren is saying also makes some sense, but so ultimately probably unsatisfying as a half true. I think that the big point here, the big takeaway, regulations on the big banks still exist. They continue to exist. They have changed slightly, and we're going to be taking years, if not longer, to kind of figure out ultimately what that means.
And I think the trick to remember, especially with a half-true statement, is that it's very difficult to boil down complex financial reform into a talking point that is 100% accurate.
Yeah.
So for Heidi Heitkamp to say there are no provisions in here that substantially affect or advantage big Wall Street banks, I mean, you can't really say that's totally true. Obviously, some banks or some financial institutions that don't have $250 billion in assets, they're going to, it's changing for them. They're still considered big banks with influence by many experts, but they're not like the biggest of the bigs.
But now we want to actually go down to the House race and a GOP primary in a Charlotte area district where we think we're hearing an attack that we expect to hear a lot, particularly when it comes to Donald Trump. So this is a race between a guy named Robert Pettinger, who is incumbent from the Charlotte area, running against Reverend Mark Harris, I believe.
Yeah.
And so what's the claim and what's going on here?
So the claim is that Mark Harris worked to stop Donald Trump from being president. It's in a TV ad that's playing in the Charlotte area, and it's a pretty striking claim. These two are kind of locked into a bit of a trend that we're seeing. Who loves Donald Trump more? Who was more loyal to Donald Trump? So they're trying to kind of out-conservative the other. And this Pittenger is saying Mark Harris worked to stop Trump. And then the ad really juxtaposes images of Hillary Clinton, and it also says that Harris opposes Trump's military plan. Right. Meanwhile, Pittenger is buddy-buddy. So the point that I think is important for people to know is that talking point is really disingenuous.
In this particular case, yes. I mean, there are plenty of never-Trumpers who are on the Republican side who did a lot to try to stop the president. I mean, Evan McMullin, a Republican, ran as an independent, tried to get a lot of votes in Utah to essentially prevent Trump from winning the White House. So in this case, the Rep Pittenger gets a mostly false for his attacks, which are pretty misleading against Reverend Harris down there in Charlotte. That does it for What the Fact, another week in the books. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to support the work we're doing, not necessarily this show, but maybe help us buy a bowling ball or something, like you can do that at membership.politifact.com. So until next week, I'm Aaron.
I'm Katie. Bye. Thanks for watching.